But the writings of our next speaker reflect her journey of faith and explore the heart's inner landscape. She's an author, a singer, and a speaker, and has been long intrigued by the power of words to shape people's lives. She's a former Miss Mississippi, and has enjoyed 2 careers in business and in education. This collaboration with the World War II survivor, Mildred Schindler Janzen, to write her memoir, Surviving Hitler, Evading Stalin, One Woman's Remarkable Escape from Nazi Germany. This led Sherye's selection as a co-recipient to the 2021 Mississippi Author of the Year Award for Nonfiction, an honor she shares with Mildred. She's written over 170 articles, poems, and short stories that Sherye's written that has been published in numerous magazines, newspapers, and books. She's a member of the American Christian Fiction Writers, the Southern Christian Writers, and the Mississippi Writers Guild. Sherye's writings have also been received additional distinctions, including Illumination Book Awards, the International Book Awards, and the National Indie Excellence Awards, and the Sunbury Press Sunny Awards. Sherye and her husband make their home in Mississippi. They are the parents of a son and a daughter who are both married, and they have 5 grandsons and 1 granddaughter. Please join with me and welcome our keynote speaker, Sherye Green.
Good morning. It is good to be with you today. I so appreciate Susan's kind invitation to join you and to share with you this very exciting and remarkable, to borrow a word from the title, story of Mildred Schindler Janzen. 4 years ago, I had the honor of getting to meet Mildred, and I'll tell you more of that story later, but of helping her share her story, her road to resilience, and her fortitude against all odds to forge a life filled with love and with laughter despite what happened to her in those wartime years. Mildred's story was released on November 28th of 2020. We're kind of at almost the 3.5-year mark by Sunbury Press, who's been a fabulous publisher for us to work with. But I began writing this book on October 28th of 2019, and I completed it 4.5 months later on Mildred's 91st birthday. When Mildred and I met, she was 90.5 years old. She's 94 now. I approximated that it took me 732 hours, 43 minutes to complete the manuscript, and that was the time that I did log. I'm sure there was more. Susan, her daughter, who's here with us today, and I've talked many times that just God's fingerprints are all over not only the story, but also the writing of it. The time for us to secure a publisher's contract from the date that we submitted the proposal was 16 days, and the time to sign the contract after date of submission was 21 days, which is very unheard of. And so we feel very, very fortunate. This is the Fritz Schindler family. This is Mildred, the family in which she grew up. And on your, left is her father, Fritz. On your right is her mother, Anna. And then in the middle is the only surviving photograph of these 4. Fritz came to America from Germany in 1922, and his wife Anna would come next 4 years later. They weren't married at the time. In fact, when he meets her in November of that year at the harbor in New York City, when her ship, the Deutschland, pulls up, they go immediately to the New York City clerk's office and were married right then. That was sort of the law that you had to do if you were an immigrant and coming in. Fritz was a thrasher, which was an agricultural term for a specialist skilled in the separating of wheat. That was one of the first questions that I asked Mildred that first day that we met in October of 2019, because in the interim between August, when Susan contacted me, and when I first met Mildred, I was made privy to a series of newspaper articles that had been written about Mildred over a long period of time between the years 1947 and the early 2000s about her life back in the United States. And so that was one of those first words that I encountered in those early articles, was that either thrashing or being a thrasher. And that was one of my first questions. Where I come from in Mississippi, a thrashing is a really bad spanking. Like if you're a child and you've done something bad, you're going to get a thrashing. Well, Mildred just called, because that is, again, an agricultural term. As I told her, I'm a city girl with a country heart. I love the country, but I did not grow up there. Fritz will work for another farmer, a man by the name of Charlie Herb, who was also a German immigrant, and they become fast friends. We don't quite know the story of how Fritz got from New York City into Kansas, but we do know he made his way. And interestingly enough, in Mildred's story, Charlie will end up marrying her father's sister, who is also named Anna, also was. Anna, Mildred's mother, generally is referred to in the story as Mutti, Muttii, which in German is the more endearing term for mother, almost maybe like in American English, mommy, that we might say. But that was the name by which her children and her grandchildren called her. Mildred is born in 1929 in Great Bend, Kansas, again to German immigrant parents. And because of the fact that she is born on U.S. soil, then she is a U.S. citizen. But within 6 months of her birth that year, her father received a letter that his mother had died and his dad needed him to come home and help him run the family farm. So as a dutiful son, that's what he does. They arrive back in Radach, which is a small village about 75 miles northeast of Berlin. If you remember your German geography, it's in the sort of the northeastern portion. This would have been very close to the Polish border. And 2 years later, after they arrive, Horst, her younger brother, is born in May of 31. These two children, Mildred and Horst, were reared on a working farm. And so a very rigorous lifestyle, up early, chores before they went to school. They would have walked into the village. They lived out from town on the family farm. And there's a wonderful map in the front of the book, one that Susan designed, that shows the outlay of the home complex itself with the outbuildings that were behind the home, but also one that a former resident of Radach that was a friend of theirs drew for them. That's really interesting to see all the family names there that are on that. Mildred's education would have ended, in the 8th grade. And that picture that we started out the slide presentation with is Mildred in the 8th grade. That was her confirmation at church. Mildred's family, her father is not a Nazi sympathizer. And so if you remember any of your German history or studying that about World War II, if you lived in Germany during the war years and you were not a fan of Hitler, then the right didn't really do anything to help promote your family even more. And so standard education would have ended in the 8th grade, which is where it ended for Mildred and for Horst. My suspicion is that the family's rural location is what really saved them in many ways and left them protected. The story is very different in that it is set against the backdrop of the end of World War II. Really, most of these events take place in that spring of 1945. And as Susan mentioned, I'm a former history teacher. I spent 20 years in the classroom. And I've taught the World War II story many times, but I've never studied this niche of the war. And if you are a war enthusiast, you know that it's just such a vast, broad topic with many, rabbit trails you could go down. So that was a lot of fun for me. But the Schindlers are going to be propelled again in the spring of this year to be on an odyssey a trip they never planned to take, that will really last for them the next 2 years post-war. Millions of other German citizens are also living the same horror. Just again, some dates from that spring. January 12th of 1945 is when the Russians will first cross the Vistula River into German territory as they're headed toward Berlin. April 30th of 1945 is the date on which Hitler takes his life. When I taught history, I used to tell my kids that, people like Saddam Hussein, Adolf Hitler, Muammar Gaddafi, Osama bin Laden, I think we're all in the same graduating class of high school. They talk real big and bad, but when push comes to shove, there's not a lot of backbone there. Also in those years I taught, especially when I went to grad school, I wrote the most fascinating class I ever took in graduate school was one on terrorism. I have a son in the U.S. Navy, and so that is a very personal subject to me. But I always told my kids, if I met a terrorist, I'd be over in the corner in the fetal position. I talk real big and bad, but it is a very fascinating topic. May the 2nd of 1945 is when Berlin will fall to the Russians, and then May 8th of that same year is Victory in Europe Day. As you remember, it will not be until the fall of that year. Truman comes into the White House because of the untimely death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and then he is forced to pull the trigger, so to speak. I'm sure he never wanted to, but has to for the greater good, but drops those atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that will end the war in September of 1945. But Mildred's story begins on Thursday, February the 1st of 1945, when Russian forces will invade her family farm. They will shell the house. There'll be a hole in the roof there. They will basically invade this home and live with this family for a number of days until they set them on the move. But they'll eat up all their food. They'll kill their livestock, destroy many of the items in the home. After about a week of being there, there's a sweet scene, or it's kind of very poignant in the book, where Mildred runs in. She and her family had been living in the village of Radok, and her parents would get up early in the morning to come into the farm to feed the animals, the cows and the pigs. And obviously, by the time the children get there, the Russians are there. And so Mildred throws her coat down on a chair and runs to the outbuilding, which is where the kitchen is located, to find Mutti. And as she comes back into the house for her coat, there's a Russian soldier with her coat in hand, leaving the opposite door of the room. And of course, you didn't question him. This is again in winter, so that would have been a great loss for her. But again, about a week later, the Russians will round up the Schindler family along with all the inhabitants of Radok, which will be about 600 citizens, men, women, and children. And they basically are told, you have 2 hours to pack up everything in your life. Think about if that were you or me, and what would we put in that suitcase, and how would you make those decisions? They will move this procession that gets larger and larger by each town that they reach toward Poland. They're moving them northeasterly toward Poland. It's wintertime. It's very cold. There are going to be many elderly people and babies or small children that will succumb to the journey and that will just be left in the ditch. And this is something that Mildred and her brother Horst have to witness. Mildred is 15 when the bomb goes off, no pun intended, but on February the 1st. She turns 16 in March of that year, and Horst is 2 years behind her. He's 13. In this, as they are on this journey, Mutti becomes very quickly aware of this is an all-male, again, military unit, these Russian soldiers that are watching these young women like wolves, basically is how they are described in many settings. But she makes a plan to disguise Mildred so that no harm will come to her, and she will rub flour on her face every day, rub lard on her neck, and then take an old cloth and wrap it around Mildred's neck to make her just as unattractive. The lard, I'm sure, had a horrible odor to it, but make her as unattractive as possible. On March 5th, this is about a month after they are taken from their home, Fritz, her father, is pulled aside one day with a group of men and told that they are needed to go help work cattle for the troops in another location. Mildred and her family will never see her father again, ever. And no explanation. To this day, they really don't know, what happened to him. Early one morning, about 3 weeks later, the soldiers arrive in the area. I'm sure as they would be on the move, they would come to a village and the troops would take possession of homes or barns or outbuildings. And so I'm thinking they're sleeping in a barn one night or maybe in an open cart with hay in it. But the soldiers arrive early one morning before Mutti is able to apply that disguise. And so Mildred is caught up in a group of young women, about 30, that are taken to a laundry Russian camp. In much the same way that Fritz was taken from the family, Mildred is grabbed from her mother and brother. No time to say goodbye. And as her wagon pulls away and she watches her mother and brother grow smaller and smaller in the distance, I'm sure all three of them were thinking again. This word tenacious, and if you've gone to the dictionary, there are many definitions, but this is the one that I felt this presentation would be the best. It means working to achieve a goal, even if it is difficult, because that's what you as a perfusionist have to do every day. Mildred and her mother and her brother at this point of separation in March of that year when she's taken to the laundry camp, all three of them have a task now, and that is to stay alive, but also to try to find each other once this horrible nightmare is over. And in the operating suite, every single day that you walk in for your work, you face challenging situations. I'm sure some of those you are expected, presenting conditions. You've done a complete physical workup of your patient. If there are some difficulties you may be looking for, and maybe you accommodate for those in a surgical situation. But then there are days when the bottom drops out, or the blood pressure drops out, or the machine fails, whatever it is, you name it, you've been there. And so you have to find a way to work around and to meet your goal, which for you in the operating suite is a successful outcome for the life of your patient. The function of a perfusionist. I will say that this has been a lot of fun for me to know more. I wouldn't say I completely understand what you do, but to certainly know a lot more. My favorite class I ever took in school was anatomy and physiology in my junior year of high school. I love the body. I love the way we are created. My father is a retired pediatric dentist, so I grew up sort of around a clinical setting. I never wanted to be a dentist or a doctor, but I love the body. I worked for a number of years with my father's practice. But it's been very interesting to learn about your work. But your job is very critical to the success of the mission of your operating team, and it's also extremely stressful. And it's been really interesting to find out about your profession, that the number of years of higher education between 4 and 6, that there are only 18 programs around the United States through which or by which you could become accredited for this work. Your job isn't, a good thing is job security. You're in very high demand. In fact, the industry standards predict a 14% growth in these next 7 years until the year 2030. Your work is very demanding. Most of you work about a 60-hour plus week, which is a lot more than I ever worked in business or in education. 43 is your average age. I was interested to find out that 61% of your cohort are male, while the remainder are female. You have a great annual salary range, well over the $100,000 mark. You're also a very select group of medical professionals. There are only 3,200 of you in the United States. And then there are basically, 3 ways, I'm sure there are more, but levels of certification at the certificate level, the bachelor's degree, which I think the great majority of people in your profession hold, and then certainly a master's level. And I would venture to say that many of you maybe had other careers or are degreed medical professionals in your own right. Anybody in here a physician and also a perfusionist? Just curious. Anybody in here a nurse first and now you are a perfusionist? Okay, that's great. That's interesting. Pardon? Okay, gotcha. From other, thank you. I know, again, for your type of work, because you do have a high stress level, the centers, the hospitals, the clinics that hire you want to make sure that you have the correct psychological profile, that you can work well in a stressful situation, that you have very high levels of skill and judgment. You have to be very detail oriented, that you also, that you play nice, that you work well with others, because there's a very diverse team of individuals that you work with in the operating room, and that also that you have competency in the knowledge of your field, and you're probably also having to stay on the cusp of that field of study, I would think, and also to help bring your surgical team up to snuff with that. One of my theses for this presentation is that crisis in our lives, which all of us face, regardless of what we do every day for a living, creates a need to perfuse. And that for me, perfusion is a workaround. It's sort of a plan B. That's what you do when you remove blood from the body and take it somewhere else through that heart-lung machine until you put it back in Mr. Jones or Mrs. Smith on the table there. But crisis in our lives does that. It faces us very quickly to figure out, what am I going to do and how am I going to do this so this will be a successful outcome? And this is what Mutti and Horst and Mildred were faced to do. Generally, there are three reactions to crisis when we are faced with an uh-oh moment in life. Some of us find false hope, and that's sort of that belief that maybe somehow things will go back to the way they were. And Mildred and her family certainly could have thought that, well, if we could get back to Ryddock or to the farm. That was not going to happen. And people that have researched this type of mindset tell us that people that sort of take this track of thinking, that it doesn't end well, because when the what if, the false hope that they're holding on to happen, then they lose more and more hope. You could also, some people lose hope altogether. They just totally shut down. I talked about being in the corner in the fetal position. I think some of us psychologically, and I've had moments in my life when I've had a crisis I was facing that maybe for a split second or for a while, that was sort of the psychological posture that I took. But a third way to react to stress or crisis in your life is to find resilience, where you have to dig deep and you have to face reality, and then you have to adapt to the changes. One of the very interesting things or endearing things to me in this journey of working on this topic for your presentation was for me to educate, again, as myself, what does a perfusionist do, and what does your life look like every day when you get up and put on your scrubs and go to work? And so in January, I'd been doing some research before that, but in January, I called my cardiologist, who's also a personal friend, and said, Harper, I need your help. Can you give me the name of a perfusionist that you would recommend? And he said, sure. Do you know a guy named David Flint? And I went, David Flint? David's an old friend. His children and my children grew up together. His wife and I taught school together. I always saw him at school functions or in the carpool line in a set of scrubs. I just assumed he was a doctor or a nurse, and I never asked him what he did. But anyway, it's been a lot of fun getting reconnected with him, but he has been able to provide me with a lot of great insight, firsthand knowledge of what you do, as he is one of you. But some of the insights I gleaned from the information that he shared with me, first of all, in your job, everything is a challenge. There's some jobs where you just, maybe it's one or two, or maybe every couple of weeks you have a fire to put out. But in your job, when you walk in an operating suite, everything is on the line, and it's very critical. There's also no one to help you if something goes wrong. This was one of those traits, I guess, or insights that really stopped me in my tracks, because this is where Mildred and her mother and brother found themselves in that spring of 1945, is there wasn't anybody to call for help. There wasn't 911. They just had to figure it out on their own. You also have a very demanding call schedule. You have long hours. You have a stressful environment. You have very little time to yourself. And then also your job, I don't know all the ins and outs of your training, but I would venture to say that there probably is not a lot of information given to you in your educational training to become a perfusionist that really helps you cope with how do you deal with the loss of a patient. And I would think everyone in this room has had to deal with that. I have lost people in my life, but I have never watched someone die per se in front of me. And I'm sure that is a very sobering thing to have to deal with, and something you have to learn to come to terms with, because you have to keep on going. And that is a given in your profession. You're not going to save every one of those patients. You know, World War II dragged millions of people down in its wake. There were some 55 million people alone in Europe that were displaced during the war. By June of 1945, that summer after the war ends, or the European theater of the war ends, there are going to be approximately 11 million displaced persons. In the literature, if you're a reader of World War II, nonfiction, DPs is the way that they are referred to. And Mildred is going to be one of 8 million of these displaced persons in Germany. And again, trying to help build a bridge between a World War II survivor and what you do as a perfusionist. In my little peon brain way of thinking, perfusion is displacement. It is a workaround. You are taking blood from the human body and you are displacing it or putting it somewhere else. I love the wonderful presentation early this morning about the oxygenator and learning how that works, but you're going to run it through that heart-lung machine, and then you're going to, at some point, put it back in Mr. Jones or Mrs. Smith on that table. And you have to, while the blood is outside of the body, there are all these technical things and chemical things that have to be done to preserve it. So when it comes back into Mr. Jones or Mrs. Smith, they're going to wake up and they're going to have a wonderful life ahead of them post-surgery. And this was the same hope for all these displaced persons in Europe, that at some point post-war, they would be able to put their lives back together. One of the organizations that will help Mildred and thousands of others come stateside during this post-war period was the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. Most of the time it's referred to in the literature as UNRWA, or I guess the phonetical pronunciation of that acronym. This would have been another great contribution that Roosevelt gives in the last years of the war. Prior to his death, was founded in November of 1943, but it was actually a 44-nation effort. It wasn't just the United States alone, but many countries around the world were realizing that there is this humongous civilian problem that they had to take care of. In the late summer of 1945, and I'll tell you the story in a little while of how Mildred gets back to her farm, but the Schindlers are going to be faced from their farm for a second time because their land is now in the Polish territory. If you vaguely remember any of your American history for the end of World War II, the Potsdam Conference takes place in July of that year of 1945, and the Soviet Union, all the winners of the war, France, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union sit down. And one of the provisions of that was that Poland got to take back some of the property that the Soviet Union and Germany had taken from them. Well, Radek, Mildred's town, is within that. And so, in fact, Susan and her cousin are going to Germany this fall, and we'll get to cross the border into Poland and go back and visit the Schindler farm. I think it's just land now, but I know that will be very exciting. Plan B. What happens in the OR when everything goes crazy? You got to find an alternative way to solve the problem. And that was the same thing that happened to the Schindlers during World War II, and thousands, millions literally of other people like them. Those years I worked in business, I was in corporate communications and public relations, but part of what I did for many of the companies I worked for was to write or edit or upgrade crisis management plans. I'm sure if you work for a hospital, your hospital has one of those. If everything goes south in a handbasket, what are we going to do? You have to know. That's kind of like disciplining your children if you're a parent. You don't wait till Johnny or Susie does XYZ. You better know what you're going to do long before that day arrives. Also in my research, trying to help better understand your stress, and because also of my great love for and appreciation of our U.S. military, I wanted to go back and study sort of the lives of Vietnam POWs, because there's a lot of information about that. And one of the things that came out of the Vietnam era was a psychological sort of premise referred to as the Stockdale Paradox, that was named after U.S. Navy pilot James Stockdale, who was captured by the North Vietnamese in 1965. And basically that says, embrace your brutal reality without ever giving up on your prevailing hope. An author, Jim Collins, if you've read his work, Good to Great, who writes a lot about corporate culture in America and leadership, is really who coined this term. But this is what Moody and Mildred and Horst had to do, is they had to come to terms with their brutal reality. And that's what you have to do in an operating suite sometimes. And it may even be out of the OR. I think most of what I've thought about in terms of preparing this is about what happens when you're in a surgical procedure, but it could be also when you meet as a team. I don't know if you do, but I would think you do almost like the military does, like an after action report. Okay, how did that go? What do we do? If this happens next time, what do we do or not do? But you may have a team member that leaves. I know there's also a lot of turnover for various reasons, as there are in a lot of industries, but I know in yours particularly there are. So what do you do in those situations? And the Schindlers were a family of faith. Now, you certainly don't come to faith in God. You don't get that grandfathered in. Each of us has to make that own decision on our own. But Mildred had seen that faith modeled in her parents. And so when that time came in her life to make that decision, that was very easy and natural for her to do. But I do believe that their faith in God Almighty was a great fail-safe that helped them in this very hard time. You've also got to keep going. When life, hands you lemons, you got to make lemonade. And then in the spring of 1945, I want to tell you about 3 episodes from Mildred's life that I believe she helped what I call find her voice. When I used to teach junior high students, and I love that age student. Most people would tell me, you are nuts, when they would find out what age student that I taught. But that's just, it's such a tender age, but a lot of great curiosity, sweet group of young people. But I would always try to encourage my students to find their voice. And that's something I would encourage you to do, even as adults. As old as I am, we still have to find ways to stand up for ourselves. I would always encourage my students, if you are scared about a subject or you don't know something, you go talk to the teacher. If you see one of your peers saying an ugly word or cheating on a test, go to them. Don't rat them out. Go to them. Stand up for the right and tell them, don't do that, or be a better person. But anyway, there are going to be 3 episodes in Mildred's life in the spring of 1945. One of those that I've mentioned is the Russian laundry camp in which she is interned. The second will be when the camp experience is over and the Russians leave to go into Berlin. She's left to go find her mother and her brother. And then at a third point, once she does find them, she's going to be separated from them again when she has to board a train, another escape plan that Mutti has come up with. The Russian laundry camp where Mildred is interned, we don't know, again, the location or the town. That was one of the things as I was interviewing Mildred, I wanted to be as specific as possible. We do know the little town where her father was kidnapped was Trebo. That was something Mildred remembered, I'm sure. But we just didn't have that data on the laundry camp. When these girls, it's about 30 girls and maybe about 10 men that are maybe there to help lift the pots of water or turn the crank on the laundry machine. Also, washboards, if you know what that is going to be the main way they scrub these shirts. But each of these women are told to wash 100 shirts a day with a piece of what was called Hitler soap. And it's about the size of the bar of soap in your hotel room here beside your sink. And they, again, were to wash 100 shirts a day. If you didn't meet that quota, or if you refused to do what you were told, you would be shot on sight. And so that's the pressure every day that Mildred and all these other young women are working on. On the 4th day of being in that camp, basically these young women are lined up for the morning, assignment. And the female officer looks at her and tells Mildred to wash more shirts. Now, remember, again, there's a major language barrier here because Mildred speaks German and this female officer is Russian. But basically, she's telling them in so many words to wash more shirts. And at that point, I just think something, and I think personally, just God inserts an iron rod. That's what I call it, down Mildred's spine. But she holds her bloody hands out in front of this officer and basically said, I'm not washing any more shirts. And she shakes her head back and forth so this woman will understand exactly what she intends. And miraculously, this woman, instead of shooting her, pushes Mildred back in the line, takes another woman out and puts her in her place. And then Mildred is given the job of planting potatoes, one that she is perfectly happy to do because she's by herself. And that's also something she's been doing with her dad and her brother since she was a little bitty girl. So she was really great at that. Also, in these 3 weeks, there will be an enormous, again, this is a very small group of women, about 30. I don't have numbers, but my intuition tells me that the great majority of these women will be raped, and probably some of them repeatedly during this 3-month internment in this laundry camp. Thankfully, again, the hand of Providence will spare Mildred, and neither she nor her mother were attacked this way during this time. We do also know statistically that about 800,000 German women and girls were deported during this time period by the Soviets into forced labor camps. As I said, this is probably early May, the Russians tell one morning, I guess at roll call or after breakfast, they just basically say, we're packing up and leaving and you can go wherever. You can go home or make your own way. And so Mildred and a group of young women set out to try to go back and find their family members. To this day, Mildred doesn't remember those young women's names. I can't even imagine the trauma that she went through in that time. During the day, they will walk along the roadside. By night, they will sleep under the stars, under cover of the forest. They will forage, in gardens or whatever they can find growing in the forest. And then along the way, as they get to little villages, Mildred will describe her mother. Mutti was very short. And then Horst, again, is 13, very tall, but he had Coke bottle thick glasses. I feel his pain because I tell my children I was a difficult delivery. I had glasses at birth, but I have horrible eyesight. But anyway, that description of the Coke bottle glasses is what will lead a woman in a particular town and say, oh yes, that mother and her son, they're right over there. And so Mildred sees her mother from afar. I can only imagine what a sweet reunion that was. But Mildred again is covered in lice. Remember again, when she's taken from her family 3 weeks prior to this, she's not given a bag, she's not given a toothbrush. She just has the clothes on her back, and that's all she still has on. She has not bathed. She said they would wash their hands in like the feeding trough or the water trough for the officers' horses. But you remember there are all these male soldiers guarding these women, and there's no way you're going to, undress yourself and wash. So washing your face and your hands was about the extent of that. Once they get Mildred cleaned up and they let her rest a couple of days, they set out. And then once the end of the war is announced by the mayor of this little village where they're living, Mildred and Mutti and Horst set out to find their farm, and they will reach Rydok. They will return to the farm sometime in late May of 1945. The house is basically ruined. It is standing. There is still somewhat of a roof on top, but the building had been used as a laundry facility, similar to the little town where Mildred has just been interned. But when they get there, Mutti is going to take her children down. This is another one of those God's thumbprints part of this story, to the basement level of that home, and it had a brick floor. And it's evidenced by the sort of the destruction in the room that the Russians had been down there looking. But over in the very far corner, there's an undisturbed set of bricks, about 11, that are still set in the dirt pavement. And Mutti will lift up one or two, and underneath it, she will find what she's looking for, which is a green canvas wrap pouch that her husband Fritz had hidden away, that has German marks, which are by now null and void, but money. There is family jewelry. There is the deed to the farm. There is Fritz and Anna's marriage certificate, but the most precious document or treasure in that packet is Mildred's American birth certificate. The thing I always try to say to readers or to audiences when I talk about this book is the world in 1945 is not the world that we live in today. You and I are all very aware of our birth certificate, wherever we hold that from, whatever nation. And an American passport, especially if you're an American citizen or whatever your country of origin, you have a passport to get out the door and then back in safely. But it was just a different time. And I don't know that really the world thought of the import of a birth certificate at that time. So this is going to be the second time I think that Mildred found her voice is when she strikes out bravely to find her mother and brother. The third time is going to be when she has to board a train to Berlin, and that chapter is titled Polish Ticket to Berlin. In the late fall of 1945, the Schindlers have come through Berlin. Mildred has an aunt, one of her father's sisters, Marieken, who lives there in Berlin, has a daughter about Mildred's age, and they will stay with them for a while, but they have a very small apartment, and it's not fair, and it's just not practical for them to stay there, so they will be moved around to some displacement camps. But finally, the family will move to Nienhagen, which is on the northeast coast of Germany. And this will be in the Soviet occupation zone. If you remember again your World War II history, post-war, German territory is divided by the four occupying forces: the Soviets, the Americans, the British, and the French. And so Mildred, her mother begged the authorities not to send them somewhere into the Soviet zone because they have just come from this very traumatic experience. But, as luck would have it, that's exactly where they're sent. But during this period, I think of that maybe May to 1945 to almost Christmas, Mutti probably suffered some type of an emotional breakdown. If nothing else, then just enormous grief or sorrow at the loss of her husband. I'm sure those weeks, I'm a mother of a daughter, and I can only imagine what she went through in those weeks before she was reunited with Mildred. What has happened to her? Has she been harmed? But trying to think, I am now the sole breadwinner. How am I going to put this together? But anyway, when the Schindlers are in Nienhagen, the mayor comes to them near Christmas and says the Soviets are taking a group of girls and they're going to put them on a train and take them to Siberia. And Mutti convinces the mayor, she says, please let Mildred stay with me. I need her to help me. And so he agrees. But he also tells her that they're going to be back here in the early spring. And for that second roundup, there's not a thing that I can do. And you need to know that. So Mutti comes up with another plan. She goes back to the mayor in a couple of weeks and says, I need a train ticket for Mildred to go to Berlin and get winter clothes. Now, when I was learning this story, I'm very literal, as my daughter is apt to tell me, but I really thought there were winter clothes. That is totally a ruse. There was nothing in the closet at Tante Marieken's house. It was just a way to get her out. But I love this line from the book. It said, placing my foot on the first step of the train car was one of the hardest things I had ever had to do. I prayed I would see my Mutti again, but on February the 3rd of 1946, Mildred will board a train from Nienhagen into Berlin, and then it will be 7 years until she sees her mother again. Some common traits of perfusionists and POWs and Mildred: you are alone. When you step into that operating suite, you are the only person that is credentialed and has the expertise to do what you do. And so you've got to be, up to bat. American POWs, as they were isolated in their imprisonment during the war, this was one of certainly the main ways that the Vietnamese would torture our service personnel. But also Mildred and Mutti and Horst were all alone. Also, you have a sense of loneliness. I would think, not being a perfusionist, but sometimes thinking you're the only person that's carrying this water for this procedure is very daunting. American POWs, again, were cut off for their family. And again, Mildred, Mutti, and Horst have lost their father and their husband. And now that Mildred's gone to the United States, they don't really have that. You also have a devotion to duty. You have very high ethical standards and moral standards that you adhere to in an operating room and for your profession every day. American POWs, their credo became return with honor, that they wanted to do everything in their power to uphold the reputation and their love for and their adherence to the principles of the Constitution of the United States of America. And Mildred likewise was a dutiful daughter to her family. Ways that I think all three groups, perfusionists and POWs and Mildred, were able to survive. Certainly you have to be physically fit. You have to also be mentally strong. And I hope there are ways that you take care of yourself that way. You also have to rely on your instinct. I call it my gut. I know that's not very ladylike, but that's kind of where I feel that part of my inner, thought life or instinct. is really in the pit of my stomach. Also, living alone. Sometimes you, again, as I've just described, are alone in a situation. You also have to have communication to survive in a medical procedure. You also have to have a workable plan for the future, that if X happens, then what are we going to do in response to that? And also living in groups. And also, as we close this program, think if you would think also, where are places like those 3 places in Mildred's story, but I bet you can think back through your professional career, where are places where you develop tenacity? Because if you don't need it today, you're probably going to need it tomorrow, but you go back and revisit those times because you have been given those iron rods to do that. Mildred will come to the United States in 1947 and make a new life. The SS Marine Marlin is the name of the ship that will bring her stateside. January 24th of 1947 is when she will sail into New York Harbor. One of my questions when I was interviewing her was, what did it feel like when you passed the Statue of Liberty? And she was like, I didn't know what that was. I just take it for granted, as an American, that everyone knows that iconic statue. But she said it was years later when she came to really understand and appreciate that. She will travel by train. She's in New York City about 2 days, and then she travels by train. Again, she's 17 years old. She's about 2 months short of her 18th birthday. She will travel by train alone to Great Bend, Kansas to meet Charlie and Anna Herb and live with them. That summer, she'll get a job in a diet kitchen at a Dominican-run hospital, St. Rose, and that basically is where they prepare the food. But she will meet a nurse there named Dorothy Harder, who is an American but is fluent in German, had learned it in college, and recognizes very quickly that Mildred speaks very little English. And so that will propel her to encourage Mildred to go back to class. Dorothy gets in touch with her old English teacher, which is a woman by the name of Esther Dobrinsky that lives nearby in a small farming community called Lorraine. And that was the high school that Dorothy graduated from. And so the Dobrinskys are very generous and offer for Mildred to come and live with them. So she will do that. Think back to your 9th grade year in junior high or high school. At my school, it was junior high, and some high schools, it's the bottom year of high school. Mildred is 18 years old when she jumps back into the educational process. But she was very fortunate. She had a very small school. There were only 7 people in her 9th grade class. Lorraine was also a farming community settled by German immigrants, and I think that also gave people a real heart for her. She was one of them. She had a dedicated faculty and staff of that school, and she also had a very welcoming group of friends that just took her right in as if she'd been with them all the time. In the fall of 1949, she's going to begin dating a very handsome local farmer, Leon Janzen. They had met at church. First Baptist Church of Lorraine will play a very significant part in Mildred's story. And Leon had also been a former graduate of the high school, but they get engaged in Christmas of 1951. Remember, again, Mutti and Horst are back in Germany. They are still in displacement camps, and because they are not U.S. citizens, they are not allowed to come stateside at the time that Mildred does. And Mildred and her family on this end of the pond, as the Brits are like to call it, are trying desperately to find ways to bring her here and a horse, which they have not. And so on May 2nd of 1953, Mildred and Leon marry. And Susan, I love that picture with your dad's hand or arm around Mildred. That was taken on their honeymoon, but I just love the look in his eyes. It's like, she's mine. And I love that. It's sweet. Mildred and Leon will have 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters, Karen, Kenton, Susan, and Galen. As their mother had, these 4 children will also grow up on a working farm. And again, Susan, it's just very special to have you here today. Leon will run that family farm. Mildred is going to balance her life as a wife and a mother with a 30-year career that she just absolutely adored at Lorraine State Bank. And also music as a part of this family's life. Certainly they would work as they kind of whistle while you work out on the farm, but also Leon was a very accomplished musician, the trumpet, but also several other wind instruments, and was a member of a polka band that will take he and Mildred on several international trips. And again, as as I mentioned, much of their life centers around their church, First Baptist Church of Lorraine. And then again, this is I think the climax of the book, but the happiest point certainly. On Thursday, October the 8th of 1953, at 1:55 p.m., the Santa Fe Express is going to pull into the train station in Hutchinson, Kansas, and Mildred is going to be reunited. In that photograph, Mutti is the shorter woman on the outside of the photograph. Horst is the taller man on the other side, and then Mildred and Leon are in the middle. I think the question I get asked the most when I talk about this book is, how did you meet Mildred? Because you live in Mississippi and she lives in Kansas. The short answer is God, but the abbreviated version is that in 2010, while I was still teaching, I had gone back to graduate school to complete a degree in history. And my mother was very kind to invite me on a trip to Europe to celebrate that milestone in my life. And so it was called the Sound of Music Tour. And we started the tour in Vienna, Austria. So that first night we get into our hotel, we eat dinner, and then we go to this meeting room, much sort of like this, to meet with the rest of our group. And this lovely lady from Lyons, Kansas sat next to us, and her name was Jean Binky. And we just really got to be friends on the trip. Well, it ends up she was Mildred's husband's cousin. Jean's maiden name was Dobrinsky. Remember the Dobrinskys that let Mildred live with them during high school? Well, Jean was part of this family. And so Jean and I maintained a friendship, and as some other books I had written were published in that 10-year interim or 11-year interim, I would send those books to Jean. And so in May of 2019, when Mildred family said, "Mom, you really need to do something with this story," Jean gave them my name. And then in August of that year, Susan contacted me. And on October 10th, and this is that first day that I had that wonderful privilege of meeting Mildred. And she tells the story. She said, "Sherye, I was so nervous about meeting you." But when she opened that door and opened her arms, it was like we had known each other all our lives. And I think it was certainly a great joy and a thrill as a writer to write that book. But the greatest gift is to become her friend and to have her as a friend. Unique features of this story. Mildred was born in America to German immigrant parents. You know, most stories like this are told about people that were from other nations. The story also contradicts a very commonly held misconception that all German citizens that lived during the Third Reich were Nazi sympathizers. They were not. This is also a Gentile account of this period. This family grew up in the evangelical Lutheran denomination, Christian denomination, and there were no Jews that lived in their small village of Radach. I know that her father had business with Jewish merchants in other towns, but Mildred did not know any personally. Most female accounts of this period are from female Jewish authors. Mildred and her mother, as I mentioned before, were spared sexual assault by the Russian soldiers. It's also a remarkable account of God's protection and providence. For me as a historian, it was incredibly fascinating because there are over 100 original photographs and documents. And we've also been told by a Holocaust educator that this is the only account of a survivor from 3 occupation forces, from German, Soviet, and the Polish. And we've also had 2 new editions of the book published early this spring, one for the classroom and one for use in churches or Bible studies. Lessons real quickly that Mildred taught me: it's never too late. She was 90 and a half years old when we met, and I don't know what your dreams are. I'm certainly talking to you today on a professional level, but you may want to learn speed rollerblading. You may want to learn a new hobby. Whatever it is, do something special with your children. Don't give up on that. It's also, don't give up on your dreams. Dreams do come true, and Mildred Schindler Janzen is living proof on that. I was also very encouraged to know that old dogs learn new tricks. I first learned that lesson in grad school because when I went back in 2006, I easily could have been anyone's mother in that room from a chronological standpoint. But also, I had never written this type of genre before, and so it was encouraging to know it could be done. Also, center your life's work around something that moves you. I hope what you do when you get up in the morning and you get to the hospital or the clinic and you enter that OR suite or that clinical setting, that you are so thrilled that some part of you is really excited, as my grandson James used to do this when he was very excited when he was a younger boy. If you don't, you may want to think about doing something else because life is just way too short. The best writing advice I ever received was from an author, famous Mississippi author who is now deceased, but she said, write about what moves you, because if it moves you, it'll move somebody else. And then also that God is full of surprises. And again, just Mildred's story is a remarkable testimony, to the strength of the incomparable human spirit. God has made us very wonderfully and creatively, and we have an enormous capacity to withhold a lot of stress. We don't like to live in that situation, but we can do it. But God, you just remember that God is faithful, even times in your life when it just seems like everything is gone. I think of all the quotes I've ever heard about leadership or the way that you think, and certainly of this World War time period, is this quote from Viktor Frankl, that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. You always have a choice. May not be the choice you want to take. And again, for Mildred, how easy it would have been for her to just sit in the corner or bottle this up, but she did not. She reared her children. This was a bedtime story on which they were told, and she shared it with countless generations to encourage them. And she has proven to me that one person can make a difference. And I just want to leave you with this. I know you know this prayer, but God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I thank you for letting me share this story with you, and I'm happy to take questions if anybody has any before our time is up.
At this time, I'd like to ask Susan to come up here too. Yeah. For sure. Just thinking about this story, I have read the book. I was fortunate to be able to read this book. Susan's been a dear friend of mine for many, many years. We reacquainted and all. We were college roommates, and her mom's story, I have met her mom. She's 94 years old, and she was going to make this trip, but unfortunately, didn't feel like she could do this, at this age right now. But I want you to be able to, I'm so glad that you are sharing this story with us. And when I think about it, it just brings me tears to my eyes. So I love this story, and thank you guys very much. And there is going to be a book signing after this in the Epic book or booth. I'm sorry, at 1:45 today. So they're going to be able to show a video also. That Susan, you want to tell this story about the video a little bit?
There's a 20-minute short documentary that has been produced, and it's won some awards too, and so we'll have that playing if you'd like to hear my mother recall some of the things that she went through that Sherye described. But we really appreciate the opportunity to share this story with you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions either now or at the booth, and I know Sherye will too. So.